Folks, thank you very much for coming today to learn a little bit about Operation Encompass. This is slated to last for 90 minutes. I can promise and assure you it's not going to last for 90 minutes, and we'll probably be looking at the kind of 45 minute mark. I'm going to go through a bit of a presentation, explain to you about Operation Encompass, where it's come from, what that looks like for us here in Northern Ireland. And then there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. And I would certainly welcome questions, but I'd ask you just to maybe leave them to the end, and you can either put questions in the chat box for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, or you can unmute yourself. But we'll come to that. We'll come to that bit at the end. So I'm just going to share my screen here, if you bear with me. Okay, so by now you should have figured this is an Operation Encompass briefing as a NISC seminar. And right at the start, I just want to nip in the bud. Encompass, which is the Health and Social Care in Northern Ireland new IT system, is nothing to do with Operation Encompass. I'm almost certain Operation Encompass predates the health service using that term Encompass. They're two separate things. It has caused a slight bit of confusion along the way, but just to be very, very clear that so if you're here expecting to hear about the new IT system for HSCNI, you're going to be really disappointed. But hopefully you're all here to hear about Operation Encompass. As Alison said, my name is James Draper. I'm a designated officer for child protection with the EA's Child Protection Support Service. Let me just introduce to you what CPSS does. Previously, before joining the EA, I was kind of 10 years in the Southeastern Trust, worked across residential, worked in Gateway for a long time. So that's kind of my background. And really in all of my time working in frontline roles for the Trust, I'd actually never heard of the EA's Child Protection Support Service until I saw the job advertisement. I'll be honest about that. So there's not a lot of awareness of what we do. We exist. We're a regional team of around about 20 people, all qualified social workers. And our job is to support the frontline safeguarding staff in schools. And we do that in a number of ways. We run a helpline. That would be, a large proportion of our work. So if there's child protection, safeguarding issues cropping up in school, and it could be from very, very, things to do with policy and procedures, or it could be a child's just disclosed this to me, what should I do? Or it could be maybe more complex cases to do with risk assessment and harmful sexualized behavior in schools. We provide direct support to our designated safeguarding teachers, to carry out their job. So that's a big thing we do. We also train the same teachers. So if you're a designated teacher in Northern Ireland, you are trained by our service. We do an initial 2-day course for those staff members, and then refresh the training every 3 years. And then also we would do specific webinars that we're rolling out about specific issues in terms of maybe neglect or signs of safety or whatever. So we play a key role in kind of upskilling and supporting the safeguarding workforce in all of our schools. We also provide kind of safeguarding services for the Education Authority. So especially in terms of maybe the EA's involvement in case management reviews, in domestic homicide reviews. We would sit on MARACs, which is the multi-agency risk assessment conferences in domestic violence case. So we'd bring the kind of education voice to that. So that's kind of day-to-day the work we do. And then we would also sit, different officers from across our service would sit on the SPNI panels. For example, I sit in the policy and procedures group. Colleagues of mine sit on the digital safety, domestic violence, all of the subgroups as part of the SPNI. So that, so it's quite a varied role. And if you haven't heard of us, that's what we do. And hopefully you have a bit of a better idea now. Okay, so I want to move on to looking at what Operation Encompass is. And what I would say from the start is Operation Encompass is really simple to understand, and it kind of suits my temperament and my skill set to a certain degree, because it's really simple stuff. It's an information sharing partnership between the police and schools in and around the issue of domestic violence, and it allows for immediate support to children who have experienced domestic abuse, who are victims of domestic abuse. What traditionally has happened in our schools is, say an incident of domestic abuse is reported to the police will go out and do their bit. They will make a referral into social services. Maybe a couple of weeks later, the social worker might call the school to do the multidisciplinary check. Be many social workers on the call here, you'd be very familiar with that. Do the multidisciplinary check, and then at that point, the school might find out a little bit about what's happened in the family home. The social worker might never get round to doing that multidisciplinary check. Sometimes the system breaks down in that way. The case might sit on a waiting list for 6 months, and then the phone call might go to the school. Maybe social services looking to close a case, or it might be a lower level incident that social services, it just doesn't meet their threshold to be involved. So there's no communication. Also, it could be a case where it's maybe still at a family support level and parents don't give their consent for the school to be contacted in a multidisciplinary check. So again, there's lots of routes that can either delay or stop a school finding out about the fact one of their pupils has been the victim of domestic abuse. And all of that time, you have a child who is sitting in school, and you have a professional that knows the child, has an existing relationship. I think one of the things that's important for us just to kind of focus on in considering this is that as teachers, as professionals, spend the most amount of time with children and young people, perhaps with the exception of, I don't know, residential social workers maybe, but out of all of the professionals in the wider children's workforce, teachers spend the most time, direct time with the children. So you have a trained professional who's got an existing relationship with the child, and then sitting a few meters away, you've a child who has been the victim of domestic abuse. By the fact that you've come to this seminar, I'm going to assume quite a lot of knowledge that I think we can all agree that children who are victims of domestic abuse, that is a traumatic experience for them. That's a very challenging experience for them. There's often a lot put on children who are victims of domestic abuse in terms of don't be telling anyone about this in school. A man's going to come and take you away. That kind of dynamic that gets put on children, by some parents. So a lot of pressure on children. And what this is about the sharing of simple information about the incident that's taken place. That then allows the teacher to do their job. That allows the teacher to respond to the emotional needs of that child who's been the victim of domestic abuse, and meet their needs. And that will mean different things in different circumstances, and we'll maybe come on to that a wee bit later. But that is Operation Encompass in a nutshell. It's really simple stuff. It's not at all complicated, and that is its strength, in my opinion. Okay, so considering the scale of the problem then, just taking some raw stats. So in the kind of last full year of the stats the police here have released, there was a significant amount of domestic incidents. There was 33,186 reported domestic abuse incidents. Not all of them will have children involved. Some of them will just be adult to adult. But what the police are reporting in their stats is that there's an increase in 6.5% from the previous 12 months. This is an increasing problem. Again, it's likely by the fact you've ended up at this seminar that you're pretty aware of the fact that it's a widespread, it's a historic problem, but it is one that's increasing, and reported incidences of domestic abuse are increasing. Some of the research done by Safe Lives, so that's the organization that coordinates the MARAC, response to things, found that 62% of children who were in cases that were discussed at a MARAC, so these are cases on the higher risk end in terms of domestic violence, had been actually physically harmed themselves. So been physically abused by the perpetrator of the abuse. And I think we all, as a children's workforce, probably have a pretty good understanding, I would hope by now, that the impact on children is significant. I think at the start of my social work career, we would see the Form Zeros come in from the police, and they would say things that Form Zero would be the form the police would use to refer into social services. They would say things like, maybe verbal only argument between mom and dad. Child in next room was not impacted. And I think probably, you don't usually see that kind of language now in Form Zeros. And I think, what probably we all have a better understanding of, a more sophisticated understanding of, is that that's nonsense. The idea that a child can be, either directly present, observing domestic violence, or even in the next room, upstairs, terrified in bed. I mean, the idea that they're not impacted by that is a fantasy. And, we know, research done by John Devaney, previously of this Paris, he did a review on the research into the impact of domestic violence on children, and it is significant. There's no doubt about that in my mind, and I'm sure all of you would agree with me. I think we also have a good understanding, or a better understanding, of adverse childhood experiences. And, Bush, in work in 2018, talks about how that can be identity forming. Actually, a child growing up as a victim of domestic violence, that can be something that impacts them throughout their life, as all adverse childhood experiences can. So this is a significant problem to which we have part of a solution. Operation Encompass cannot solve everything, but it can help support children who are victims of domestic violence. Okay, so Operation Encompass, it's not something we've come up with in the EA. It's something that has been tried and tested and developed elsewhere. And, one of the benefits in Northern Ireland is sometimes we can be magpies, and we're a small country. We look at what other people have done, and if things work and if things are good, we can nick them, essentially. Operation Encompass was started by effectively a husband and wife team. So Elizabeth Carney Hayworth was a head teacher of a school, and her husband David was a police sergeant. And they have a short video on their website that talks about how the very genesis for this idea came into being. So I'm just going to stop sharing the slideshow here, and I'm going to share this very short video, if you bear with me, please. And this explains it far better than I can.
Operation Encompass was created at the end of 2010. A Year 2 child came into his classroom in my school, and his teacher immediately sensed that his demeanour was different, and he couldn't tell us why. His behaviour started to change. First of all, he was refusing to come out of his classroom. Then he would hide under the tables in his classrooms. As the days went on, he just became more and more dysregulated. He started running from his classroom, and actually he started lashing out at those of us who were trying to help him. He couldn't tell us why, and his mother couldn't tell us why. We all broke up for the summer holiday. In the September, he started his new junior school. In the October, I had a visit from my education welfare officer. And actually, almost as a passing comment, she said, "Oh, I've had a notification about that child." And I said, "I have had no notification whatsoever." And she then went on to detail an incredibly violent domestic abuse incident that had happened in that little boy's home in June. And straight away, I knew that is why his behaviours had changed. And I was both furious and devastated. I was devastated because we'd failed that child, but we were failed as a school because nobody had shared that information with us. So I went home that night and I said to David what had happened. And David actually just sat there and went quiet because he knew that the police had that information, and he knew that there must be a way in which he could enable schools to have that information straight away so that that would never happen to a child again. And that's how Operation Encompass was born.
Okay, again, emphasis on the simple here. How did it take us so long to come up with that? So that was the I suppose the genesis of Operation Encompass and how it came about initially in England, and it's something now that has spread across England and Wales. I think it's around about a decade old, maybe longer. And I think for us here in Northern Ireland, within the sector, within the wider safeguarding and kind of domestic violence sectors, that there's been a demand and a desire to bring Operation Encompass here to Northern Ireland as well, just because it's kind of a no-brainer in many sense. The Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland were eventually tasked with developing a pilot, which we'll come on to speak about at the minute. And there's also a lot of lobbying by the likes of Women's Aid and others. And eventually down the line, especially when we got into having to develop legislation for this, there was cross-party political support amongst the Justice Committee. This is obviously in the previous Assembly mandate. So there were lots of horses pulling in the right direction here. This is an idea existed elsewhere. It was spotted by people in the sector here. We wanted to bring it in to Northern Ireland, and there was really a lot of support from many different avenues in relation to that. So the SPNI, for which I think you'll all be familiar with, but that's set up by statute, and it's kind of the membership organisation to promote kind of cooperative working and improvements in the child safeguarding sector here under their domestic violence subgroup. A pilot project of Operation Encompass was launched here. So we launched in September 2021. And initially we targeted 60 schools in the Downpatrick area. And that was done because they're all schools that are covered by Downpatrick police station. So there's a single police station. So that's a single set of crews responding to calls and a defined area in terms of schools. So it was the idea being, let's start small, let's test it out, let's see how it works here, and we'll have that continuous feedback loop, and continuous discussions. Let's learn from how it's going on, and let's improve as we go on. Stage 2 of the pilot then included a further 77 schools in the Newry area. So that was in February of this year of 2022. Those additional 77 schools joined the pilot area, and then that meant that entire policing district, which if you think of a way you might understand it better, is the same as the local council area. So the Newry, Mourne and Down district council area. So you're really talking, if you do a sweep from Newry round to Kilkeel, all the way around Newcastle, Downpatrick, up as far as Saintfield, so really the kind of boundary of Belfast there. So that entire kind of sweep of area, all the schools within that area were included eventually in the pilot project. We had significant positive feedback from school staff. They were just saying things like, this is letting me do my job. This is helping me to do my job. Things are making sense. Just like you saw in that small video there, the penny dropped. Unless we know something traumatic has happened in the life of a child, it's harder for us as professionals to see that as trauma-based behavior. And teachers were certainly saying this was helping them to do their job and to ensure they could support children. One of the, I suppose, a downside of the pilot project, but just one of those things, it was what it was that we had to rely on parental consent. After looking at a few different avenues, the legal advice came back that the police didn't have the power to share the information directly with schools here, just because our legislation differs from what they have in England and Wales. So parental consent was initially required, which meant there were some families, and often the more difficult, challenging cases, where, as you'd imagine, parents weren't given consent for the information to be shared. But really, that was worth living with at that time, because it was about getting this up and running, and that was the important thing. So then we worked with the Department of Justice to bring in the relevant statutory regulations here to solve that consent issue. See, as social workers, our DNA is working with people. It's partnership. It's, let's do this together. But there is also, and it's the whole partnership and control kind of debate that's as old as our profession. There's also a need actually to have the statutory powers to protect children, and we felt, and certainly how Operation Encompass works in England, and certainly how we wanted it to work here, that actually we did need the power to share information with schools regardless of parental consent. So the enabling legislation for Operation Encompass was included in the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act. That is the piece of legislation that brought in coercive control. That's probably what it's most known for within our sector. And then ourselves and the police worked with the Department of Justice for secondary legislation, statutory regulations, which ended up being the Domestic Abuse Information Sharing with Schools, etc. regulations, Northern Ireland, 2022, something nice and catchy. I think worked with a brilliant team in the Department of Justice. I think the comment I would have is, if you're ever involved with any kind of writing of statutory regulations or legislation, it's kind of a bit like a sausage factory. You don't kind of want to know how it's all made. It's more the final product is the main thing. But we eventually got there, and they were laid before the Assembly, and they were passed into law, and the statutory regulations went live on the 1st of April. So what that meant is, from the 1st of April, those approximately 140 schools in the Newry, Morn and Down District Council area, they immediately became a kind of full-fat Operation Encompass, where parental consent was not required. And this is the legislation that we are continuing to roll out Operation Encompass in Northern Ireland under. So we have done recently, at the start of October, I think the 10th of October, we did our first kind of major part of the rollout, given that there were schools already within the Southeastern Trust area and the Southern Trust area already in Operation Encompass as part of the pilot. We targeted those two trusts first for the rollout. So a further 325 schools in Set and Southern Trust joined around about a month ago. So really we're talking Armagh, Portadown, across to Lisbon, Bangor, Ards Peninsula, kind of skirting Belfast there. The next phase is going to be in the Northern and Western Trust areas, who are going to come live in February 2023, and we're very busy as a service at the minute recruiting and training the schools for them to be ready for the end of February. And then the Belfast Trust area is going to be joining the scheme on the 8th of May. So by the end of this academic year, every single school, or certainly every single school that has a relationship with the Education Authority in Northern Ireland, will be operating Operation Encompass. Before we go on to kind of look at the implications for different groups, I wanted just to show you another video. So this is a video that I stole. I haven't stolen it. I'm using it off the internet. It's publicly available. From the Victoria Derbyshire show, did a segment on Operation Encompass, and this is Elizabeth Connie Hayworth, who's the founder of Operation Encompass, talking about the kind of impact for her as a teacher. I'm just going to do a new share here, so if you bear with me. And this clip's about 3 minutes long.
To get it set up in a handful of schools in Plymouth and the surrounding area.
Operation Encompass is an incredibly simple idea. What it means is that if there is a child in a home and the night before there's been a call to the police and there's been domestic abuse, I as a head teacher will be told that that has happened prior to 9 o'clock the next school day. And what it means is that we, their teachers, who will spend large parts of their time with us, that we can actually do some support for them. If they come in and they haven't got their school uniform, we can have school uniform ready so they don't feel any different. If they haven't had breakfast, we can make sure that they have some breakfast. We can actually just sit down with them and say that we know something horrible happened at home last night, and if they want to talk to us about it, they can. And because we know that this is a home where there is domestic abuse, we would always have a kind of special eye, special attention on those children.
That's where Jane and her son come in. We're calling him Alex, and he was just 5 years old when the scheme was introduced at Liz's school. This is the first time the mother of a child who's been on the scheme has spoken to the media. We wanted to speak to Alex as well, but understandably Jane was worried it would be too upsetting.
It was just horrendous.
So she told me what they'd been through.
He'd seen me getting my hair pulled, but really to the point where I couldn't put my head back up. And then we went out for a while, and as we come back, he'd locked all the doors and we couldn't get back into the house. And I phoned the police, and there was just shouting and screaming, lots of shouting and screaming.
So what do? You're making a post.
Liz remembers it well.
What are you doing?
It was the first Operation Encompass call she'd ever received.
I got the call to say that there'd been an incident at his home the night before. I went down and spoke to his reception class teacher and prepared her for it. When he arrived at school, Alex brought with him a teddy bear. Now, normally, when a child brings a teddy bear to school, we would say to them, is Mummy taking the teddy bear home with her, or shall we put the teddy bear somewhere safe in the classroom? But because we knew what had happened, his class teacher didn't do that. And she let him just bring his teddy bear into school. And he hugged that teddy bear all day long. All we did was not ask that the teddy bear go home and not ask that it was put somewhere safe. We left him to hug his teddy. For us, that was absolutely nothing. But to that little boy, it was everything.
And that really, really helped. It helped him and it helped me to stay strong, because I knew that I wasn't just sending my little boy to school to be worrying about what's going on at home, feeling frightened, not having no one to talk to, because the head teacher and his teachers were made aware of this. So they really nursed him and, you know, give him all the attention that he needed. They give him that little bit more. And he come out of school that day much brighter than when he went in. And it makes my hair stand up. It really does. Because I didn't want to send my baby to school that day. You know, he was upset, everything else. So that was a lot of weight taken off my shoulders, so I could concentrate on trying to clear up the mess for starters, and then thinking on my next move to get away from this situation.
I think, again, that's a video clip that speaks for itself. But again, for a mum who's been the victim of quite horrific domestic violence, even that peace of mind to be able to say he came out of school brighter than when he went in, and you know the burden being lifted off her shoulder. Again, you know, it's really showing the obvious utility of Operation Encompass. Okay, so we're gonna crack on here. So the implications then, this is just a bit of an overview of the implications for the different groups involved in Operation Encompass in Northern Ireland. There's obviously implications for ourselves in the Education Authority. We're currently in a very high intensity phase of rolling this out. Operation Encompass was included in the latest Department of Education Child Protection in Schools guidance that was updated in June of this year. But I mean, really what we find with schools is that schools are being sent guidance about a million things, or, you know, almost every week. You know, being a school leader at any time is challenging. I think after the last couple of years, particularly so. And what we can't allow to happen with this, that, you know, this needs to be done right. And we as a service need to be able to stand over the fact our schools are ready to take these calls and have everything in place to deal with them properly, from a kind of point of view of supporting children, but also from a kind of wider information governance perspective. We have over 1,100 schools and education other than at school centres in Northern Ireland, which is a hell of a lot. I think if we think about things that have been rolled out, and if we think about we bring a new thing into social services, I mean, the number of social services teams would be a fraction of that number. And each school has their own safeguarding setup, has different cultural needs, has a different kind of background, serves a different population. So it is a lot of work for us as a service. Once it is up and running, there'll be more low intensity kind of demand on us, but we will have to do ongoing training, ensuring that as the staff churn, people keep their training up to date. And also we on our helpline, we'll offer advice and support, because often there are some of our safeguarding teachers that when they get the call in the morning, they'll have full confidence of how to respond to it. And there are other maybe ones of our safeguarding teachers who might think, oh, I'm a bit overwhelmed here, I'm not too sure what to do. And we provide it, they can call us and we can give them advice about that. So there is going to be extra workload on us kind of in perpetuity, but that's okay. That's what we are. We're here to support school staff, to support children better. There's also a bit of a feedback loop within the regulations that if, for example, the police are at the house and maybe there's a very difficult arrest and assaults on police, we're not expecting them to be able to get the name of the school off the parent on every single occasion. It is the expectation that they'll do that, but just real life doesn't work like that. So in those occasions where the police are unable to obtain the name of the school, the police can contact the education authority with a name and date of birth. We can obviously consult our systems, and the legislation allows us to share that type of information with the police, who can then make the call as normal. The implications for our schools, then, there is a bit of work to be done for them to get this up and running. There's things like they need to alter their child protection policy. There's a data protection impact assessment. We've tried to do as much of that work for them to take the burden off them. And there's training again for the core safeguarding team. The way safeguarding and child protection works in schools is that there is a core team of the designated teacher, often supported by a deputy designated teacher, and the principal is also in that safeguarding team. And the most of the bulk of child protection type information never leaves that team. It's not shared with class teachers. There will be occasions when that has to happen, and in this case with Operation Encompass, again, the regulations allow for that if appropriate. To share some information with the class teacher who's directly working with the child. But largely speaking, when information comes in from other sources, for example, from social services, it stays within that team. There are existing regulations and policies about child protection information, and really we're just piggybacking on the back of that. So there's record keeping and governance implications for schools. And again, the feedback so far from our designated teachers is that, yeah, it's a bit of extra work to get up and running, but once it's up and running, it shouldn't significantly add to workload. And actually, all the teachers are saying it's definitely worthwhile. It's definitely worth the extra effort they had to put in to get it up and running within the school. So implications for colleagues in the PSNI, we've obviously worked kind of very, very closely with the police, and we've very good relationships between the EA and the police in terms of rolling this out. It's an increased workload for them. To my knowledge, the police haven't been given any extra resources to roll this out. We haven't been given any extra resources to roll this out. This is being done largely because as a group of professionals, we think it's the right thing to do, and we have the support of our organisations. If not any, there's no kind of extra funding at the moment from higher up. So it is an increased workload for them. And as you all know, the police have a million different demands on their resources. It's a change in culture for frontline police. I think we'd all appreciate that being a frontline response police officer is a challenging, difficult job. Again, with many, many demands on their time, this is something else they have to do, but few maybe teething issues with kind of getting that rolled out, but that's to be expected. There's then the resources needed for making the calls. The calls are currently made to schools by the community hubs. Every policing district in Northern Ireland has what's called a community hub, led by a sergeant with a team of constables, and they're the ones actually making the calls the following day. And this is a new way of working for the police. I mean, the police, if you know anyone police, they'll kind of tell you when you join the police, you're kind of told, don't be telling anyone about anything, otherwise you lose your job. And that is understandable, and that is the culture they have. But actually, what we know in the safeguarding world is that we need to share information with each other to protect children. So this is a new way of working for the police, but one, it's a challenge that, you know, certainly the key people I work with are well up to meeting. Implications for our families then, and really the children are at the heart of all this. That's the reason why, you know, we get out of bed in the morning, and the reason why we're looking to roll this out. We would hope that it would mean increased safety for children. There's another professional who's better informed about what the risks are and can, you know, offer that immediate emotional support to a child. There's real power in kind of knowing that someone knows something. So Operation Encompass takes the burden off the child about this being a secret or something maybe they would have to tell a teacher about. That burden's lifted because the police have done that work in speaking to the school. And what, you know, again, most of you here work with people, you understand this. You know, if you know someone knows something that's big and a bit of a burden, actually, in a lot of occasions, you feel more confident in sharing and telling. And, you know, potentially what we might expect to see is actually an increase in children disclosing other things. Because again, this is kind of like lancing the boil, really, in terms of, you know, school staff are not dragging children out and shining a light in the face and saying, tell me about what happened last night. And, you know, that's not the point of this. That's not what our school staff will be doing. But just by the very fact of letting the child know they know something's happened, you know, that opens up opportunities for the children, and also I would say for adults as well. You know, thinking about the traditional social work role, often that can be a challenging relationship between parents and social workers, because parents are often, you know, very afraid of the children being taken away or whatever. That's a typical thing you hear from a lot of the families that we would work with. But actually, again, with schools have a slightly different relationship with families, and often teachers know the parents from having taught them. You know, schools as institutions are really rooted in communities, and they have a long institutional memory. You know, and it could, and again, we're not asking teachers to be social workers. We're not asking them to be women's aid or counsellors, but it is, you know, there is that power as well for maybe a parent to open up to a teacher to talk about what's happened, and then for the teacher to maybe signpost them to get appropriate help. We're hoping that, amongst other things, this will improve the educational experience of young people. And in that last clip we saw there, you know, this idea of this child potentially arriving very emotionally dysregulated. You know, a very simple, basic intervention by school staff. Over the course of the day, he comes back down to baseline. You know, and it stands to reason that that will lead to better educational outcomes for children. And then the signposting as well. And again, that's the role of the designated teacher, to be signposting the family to get support where appropriate. Okay, so implications for social workers and others in the sector. Really, it's an awareness of the Operation Encompass is here. It's here to stay, and you know, it's now a kind of core part of the safeguarding landscape. You know, it doesn't, you know, it is between the police and schools. It doesn't necessarily involve initially lots of legwork for social services, although I understand in some parts of England and Wales they have far more linkages between the you know, all of those organizations. But really just an awareness that this is happening, and this is part of our landscape now, or at least will be by the end of this academic year. There would be, certainly on my behalf, an expectation of improved information sharing via multidisciplinary checks. So you're the social worker, you're calling up the school, you know, can you tell me about the family? If it's a new case that, say, come into Gateway and then been allocated, and then eventually that call's being made, it's likely not, it's not 100% sure, but it's likely the police will have already made that Operation Encompass call to the school. So the designated teacher is already going to be aware there's been the issue. They probably have already spoken to the class teacher. They might have already checked the notes that they already hold, in best case scenario. So when that phone call comes in, the school should be able to provide really up to date, really accurate, really relevant information to, do their part into inputting into the social work risk assessment. So I think that there is the expectation. It's kind of quite hard to kind of grasp this and prove this, but it certainly is my expectation that going forward, that is something that social services should notice the difference in. There's also implications for our sectoral partners in the likes of Women's Aid, Men's Advisory Project, again, because we are not asking teachers to take on the burden of everyone else's roles, but realistically, if they are having a conversation with the parent in the playground about something that's happened, if it just comes up, we would be expecting staff to be signposting and encouraging, again, saying to parents, listen, would you go and get a bit of support from them, that I've heard they're really good. So that should be maybe it's another layer of amongst lots of other layers in kind of trying to get victims to engage with services, especially for them. There is the potential increase in disclosures, like what I spoke about on the last slide, that power of knowing that so maybe there's a domestic incident reported, and the teacher says to a child, listen, we know the police were around last night. If there's anything you want to talk about, you can ask to speak to us. Do you want to come in and have a cup of juice or something? And the child says, oh yeah, for talk's sake, daddy hit mommy last night. And then there's a pause, and then, oh, also daddy hit me 2 weeks ago. So I mean, I think again, we all work with people. We all understand the what's at play here in terms of that dynamic. So there could be a potential increase in disclosures, and if that happens, I mean, it happens. It's an extra workload on the trust then in terms of responding to that, but that's all for the good. That we all exist. Safeguarding exists to support children and ensure that they are kept safe. Then there is might be a bit of an area to be worked at here, in that the police will always refer to social services regardless of whether they're making an Operation Encompass call. That's still going ahead. It's still social services' job to carry out the risk assessment part of this. Operation Encompass does not on its own do risk assessment. It can contribute to it, but that is a role that remains with social services and the police, with those two agencies. But there might be times, and when schools get Operation Encompass calls, they're not going to be referring them on to social services. That's the police will have already done that. But there will be times where maybe schools more might come out, the child might disclose organically, and we'd be expecting teachers to give us a call at the Child Protection Support Service. Likely in a scenario that's as black and white as that, we'd be advising the school to contact social services to pass that information on. We're not trying to double up or put extra pressure on social services. This is very much about supporting what they do, and we'd be very clear. I've been speaking to lots of trust social work teams in preparation for this rolling out. In and of itself, Operation Encompass is not a reason to close a case. Like I say, it doesn't have that risk assessment element. Schools are not taking on the mantle of assessing risk to children in family homes. We will play our part, and we will be key partners in that, as we have been and will continue to be so. But just because an Operation Encompass call has happened, that in and of itself is not a reason to close a case. Now, my career as a social worker, lots of times I close cases on the basis of there's good professional monitoring. The school knows the crack. Maybe a relationship's ended, and the school knows that if they get any sign of, say, dad being back on the scene, it'd be referred back into them. That's still fine. That will continue to happen. I'm not criticizing that in any case, but that work by social services in terms of the risk assessment and the thresholding will need to continue. Just because an Operation Encompass call has happened, that isn't a reason to close a case. So wider engagement strategy then, we've had a couple of articles now on the BBC website. We've been on BBC Radio Ulster talking about this when the pilot was launched. I'm personally engaging with our local PSNI safeguarding panels, and then I'm also linking in with social work teams just to kind of brief them on what is happening in the areas. We're doing this NIST seminar today And we're also open to suggestions. I've spoke to all different types of groups. The local government safeguarding group I've been to speak to. We want to get the voice out there that Operation Encompass is here, and get that awareness out there. Okay, we're coming into land now. You'd be very pleased, and I was pretty much bang on in terms of my 45 minutes, so I'm happy enough with that. I thought I would just go through a few numbers then, so to give you an idea of really the impact of this. And I think when we're talking about numbers, it's always worthwhile remembering that behind the numbers, there's children who are victims here, and there are professional staff, both in the police who are responding and also in our schools, who are working and engaging with children and are doing their job, well in the majority of cases. So currently, with the pilot schools and the latest phase of the rollout, we've 462 schools already live with Operation Encompass in Northern Ireland. And we've over 600 schools still to join. So we've a bit of work to do yet. We've well over 1,000 teachers will have trained. It's just the staff on the school safeguarding teams need to do the Operation Encompass training, because they're the only ones permitted to take the calls. And that, there's probably around 2,000 more teachers for us to train. And I was speaking with a lot of teachers on Monday. Again, we've more information sessions coming out over the next number of weeks across the Northern and Western Trust areas. In terms of the numbers then, in terms of the calls from the pilot scheme, so from September 21 to January 22, so that was just when it was 60 schools, there were 130 children who the police saw as notifiable in terms of Operation Encompass, so were present or linked in some way to a domestic abuse incident. And 50 of those, there was consent given for 50 of those children to have the Operation Encompass call made. So you can see there, that's a bit of a difference. It's well under half of parents consented. That's not a surprise, and really was more of a use case for why we needed the legislative change for this. When the pilot expanded then from February of this year through to March, before the regulations came in, there was a further 124 children. So in quite a short space of time, quite a significant amount of children. And really that can be explained by the fact that, we were then including Newry, which is, would be a very built up area, as you know. And then from the regulations coming in from the 1st of April of this year through to the kind of the end of August, the end of the academic year, there were 532 children referred. And obviously that's post regulations coming out. So all of those were subject to an Operation Encompass call. So between September 21 and August 22, so starting off just with 60 schools, going to 140, and then taking in and then becoming the full fat version of Operation Encompass with the regulations, there were 786 children present, and there were 650 children subject of an Operation Encompass notification. So again, this is just in the one Newry, Morn and Down area, and those children attended 429 schools. Obviously in that number there'll be schools will have called multiple times, there might be siblings, a couple in the same school, so it's not 429 separate schools, but it's 429 instances where the police had to contact a school in relation to Operation Encompass. Again, for any of you here, you're likely here because you work in this sector or have some knowledge of it. The scale of these numbers is not really a surprise, unfortunately. So then since October, so we launched a month ago in the southern and southeastern areas, there's been at least 183 children referred. We're actually one of the policing districts I asked for stats for, actually the largest policing district, I think, has been unable to get them back to me in time, but it's likely to be closer to 300, I would imagine. And then I think, really it's anyone's guess what the future numbers are going to be when we roll this out to all of Northern Ireland. Like, we don't have the likes of Derry, the likes of Belfast are not included in this yet. Most of the population isn't covered by this yet. So I think we can all expect that number to go up. It's worth saying that Operation Encompass, by its very design, only can work in scenarios where the police are involved. And what we all know about domestic violence is that victims often will be victims of abuse multiple times, many years in some cases, before they seek help from anyone, let alone the police. So the problem of domestic violence is far bigger than what the police know. And so the children who are victims of domestic violence that we find out about through this scheme are the tip of the iceberg. So we still need our school staff, our staff in every sector, to be really vigilant for the signs of domestic violence, a child living in a home, because domestic violence is always a child protection issue. Okay, so just some final thoughts before I finish off. Implications for our sector. For me, this shows the power of information sharing. I've got this rather unpleasant graphic here of heart and veins, and the way I see this, and conceptually the way I see this, is in the safeguarding system, of which I'm a part of, you're a part of. Like, information is the blood that pumps round the system. So by sharing information with each other, that's how we keep children safe. That's how we support families. That's how we make improvements in this area. Don't take my word for it. Read every case management review ever written since they started in the 1950s. Information, so someone always knew something that wasn't shared appropriately in the vast majority of cases. So I think, again, this is simple stuff. A comment I've had from schools, and this is not meant as an attack on anyone or any service, is I've had schools say to me, right, this is great, but can you now do CAMS? Because we've no idea where children are in the CAMS waiting list, and that they're self-harming in school every day, and we want LinkedIn. Or they say, can you now do social services? There is some great practice out there, communication between schools, but sometimes things happen, like children are even brought into care and no social worker never phones the school to tell them. That's obviously bad practice. I'm sure anyone from the trust wouldn't seek to defend that, but it does happen, and teachers can be a bit frustrated by that. And also happy, just for balance, to say teachers sometimes aren't the best at sharing information as well. It's a problem across our system. I don't want to single out any single agency or professional grouping. I think for me, my personal views is not necessarily a view of the Education Authority, that Operation Encompass sparks a bit of a legitimate debate about the scope and limits of information sharing. We have family support cases with the trust where social workers aren't allowed to do multidisciplinary checks and check in with schools because they need parental consent at that point, because it's not a child protection case. As a social worker, I often found that a bit frustrating. And just as we've needed legislation here to solve this issue for Operation Encompass, is there scope for legislation for policy change? And I say there's a legitimate debate, because there'll be people on the other side of the debate might say, well, listen, no, parental rights is very important, parental responsibility, working in partnership, getting permission from parents. And I'm certainly not of the view that we need to, trample on parental rights or anything like that. But I think my personal view is, as a system, we all need the proper powers to be able to do our job properly and to work together for the benefit of children. There are limits of Operation Encompass. It is not going to solve all the issues to do with domestic violence and children and the impact on children, but it's going to go some way into making sure children feel that they're important and that they are safe and their emotional needs can be met, which is ultimately what the school are doing. It's that initial emotional first aid that school staff do anyway. If a child goes into school now and they look a bit down and a bit sad, a teacher, I guarantee 100%, one of the teachers will say to them, how are you? What's happened? Are you okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? That's a natural educational interaction. And that's what is really going to continue happening with Operation Encompass. My final point before I end is that sometimes simple is okay. This is simple stuff, but it's effective stuff. And I think thinking critically across, say, the social work landscape, is often new forms of practice and new models are brought in that can be a little bit complicated and can really need many years to bed down. But really, I think there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit about things like this that are pretty simple, that we can work together. We're a small country, we can get stuff done, and sometimes simple is okay. And sometimes simple is the best. I'm going to open the floor for questions, because no doubt my personal failings will be that I've missed something really obvious that I haven't spoken about here, and questions are a great way for us all to learn. So I'm gonna open the floor for questions. You can put them in the chat box, or you can put your hand up on Zoom, and I'll just say your name. But I've put my email address there, that if anyone has any particular queries or anything they want to link in with me about, please, you're welcome to take down that email, and I'll get back to you at some point, depending on how many people I have contacting me. So thank you very much for all for listening. I can see the chat box here. Oh, that's just Alison. So Elizabeth Anderson's asked a question: is information shared with colleges and universities as well as schools? So colleges, further education colleges, are included in Operation Encompass. That falls under the Department of I want to say economy, I guess. Maybe I'll be wrong, but it's a different department. But there are civil servants working on that. I suppose there's no in a way that there's the Department of Education, EA, and then the schools. There isn't an in-between body between the department and the colleges. So it's directly the civil servants are working on that for the colleges. I'm not entirely sure when they're joining. It's just not it's not my area of expertise, but certainly that is being worked on. Universities wouldn't be covered because universities would have, well, you'd be an adult, you'd be over 18. So this is purely looking at children, and that's one of the rightly, in my opinion, that'd be one of the limits that's in the regulations. Thank you for that question, Elizabeth. Okay. Is there a procedure for informing education welfare officers if the case is open to them? Thanks for that question, Jackie. That's one from our side of the house. There isn't at the minute, Jackie, and the legislation just focused purely on schools. But in terms of that wider question about how we share information with each other and who has access to what, I think it's a good question that is raised. So that's not something that's included at the minute. The scope of the regulations just focused on schools. But I can understand certainly the argument for education welfare officers being informed, and it might be something that we take up in the future. So Samantha Tully has asked, just wondering about schools that fall outside the EA. Is there any scope for them coming on board? Without getting into the complicated nature of the Northern Ireland education system, which is one of the most complicated things on the planet, we have a relationship as an EA, certainly as in the safeguarding part of the EA, we have a relationship with almost every single school in Northern Ireland, whether they're direct EA. We have a similar relationship, the likes of the CCMS schools, integrated schools. They all get the same service from us in terms of safeguarding, so they're all in, or all of those big major bodies. There are lots of independent schools, maybe smaller Christian schools, that while they necessarily don't have the same relationship with the EA, they provide a service from us. We train their teachers, we offer them advice. We are open to every single school in Northern Ireland. There's maybe a small number of schools who don't want a relationship with anyone in authority at all, and probably they're the schools that they're not covered by this scheme, because we cannot stand over the fact they've done the training and they have the governance in place, because they don't want to be involved. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to really go into details about that, but that is the case. Okay. Oh, David and Elizabeth Carney Hayworth are actually come to this call. That's nice to know. Thanks for the prior warning. They're saying on the chat, it's worth mentioning that once Operation Encompass is embedded, parents will often come in, as will children, and say there's been an Operation Encompass event, even when the police have not been called. Yeah, that could happen. What we're finding so far within the PSNI is they've set the threshold for sharing information to be very low, to be honest. And that's really there. I don't want to comment too much on that, because that's a police decision to make. It's their information to share. But there's a lot of very, very lower level things which are being shared, and I think that's a good thing, because again, what we know about the lower level things and domestic violence, they're often a sign that there's bigger stuff, and a lot of those lower level events can certainly have an impact on children in a cumulative way. Thanks, David and Elizabeth. Someone asking if they can access this online through NISC. It has been recorded, and if you speak to Alison, I know nothing about that, she'll be able to say. The slides are also going to be shared. Sorry, I'm just going down through. What resources are designated teachers? This is a question from Mairead Macaulay. What resources are designated teachers encouraged to share with young people? You work for Childline, so you'd be keen to have our support suggested to young people. Yeah, I mean, certainly that would be, Childline would be one of the many resources that we would encourage school staff to share with children and young people. We provide lots of information to teachers. Ultimately, it's down to them to, as a professional on the ground, to decide how they would signpost children. But if it's something you want to kind of follow up with ourselves at CPSS, Mairead, I'm sure we'll be open to having conversation. Just going down, and someone's asked, do both parents have to consent to Operation Encompass? See the consent issue from the 1st of April of this year, that's no longer an issue because it doesn't require parental consent. The police have the power, in the same way in a child protection situation, the police have the power to share information. It's the same kind of thing. So parental consent is not required for the Operation Encompass call. Okay, I think that's all the chat box questions. I hope I've done some kind of justice in that. Does anyone want to ask a question? Otherwise, if there's a reaction button at the bottom and you can click raise hand, and I'll ask you to unmute and go ahead. To do it in a perfect world, we would, but maybe that's something that might happen over the next
in the future. Keep us in mind, you know where we are, and thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for attending, and we will share information with you this afternoon.